Hello and welcome to ATARC's webinar series. Today, topic experts will share strategies that agencies can implement to alleviate the concern of the unknown and make operations more efficient. My name is Kirsten Patton. I'm a performance consultant over at Dale Carnegie, Tampa Bay, and I will be moderating today's panel discussion. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and ATARC is a nonprofit organization that brings together government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. ATARC provides ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. Welcome all of our attendees logging in. Hello, and a special thanks to Kelly Lee from Veeam and Brianne Armit from Pure Storage, as well as the entire Veeam and Pure Storage team. This afternoon, we are going to hear from our panelists, followed by a Q&A session where we will pop in a few polls and answer any audience questions that come through. So with that said, before we begin, I just want to encourage you all at home to please submit those questions of your own in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and also answer the poll questions in order to ensure that you receive your CPE credit. All right, with that all said, I would now like to welcome our panelists to please go ahead and come on camera, and you can go ahead and unmute yourself because we're going to begin with a round of introductions. Share with us who you are, what company or agency you're with, and anything else you'd like our audience to know. Let's start with Stephen, please.
Sure. Good afternoon. Stephen Hernandez here, Chief Information Security Officer, U.S. Department of Education, and also the co-chair of the Federal CISO Council. Great to be here today.
Thanks, Stephen. Moving right along to Ankur.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ankur Saini. I am the Director of Information Technology for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and I also serve as the Chief Data Officer for the agency.
Thank you. Let's hear from Aaron next.
Hi there, everyone. Aaron Murphy. I work for Veeam as a technologist in the CTO office and also on product strategy. I'm based in New Jersey, originally from the UK, and I've been doing data protection, recovery, and availability for over 25 years.
Thank you. And Nick?
And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nick Saki. I'm the principal from the Office of the CTO for Pure Storage, covering North American public sector.
Thank you. And we may have an additional panelist joining us pretty soon. That'll be Alicia Andrews. I'll have her introduce herself when she gets here. But she's with the Commonwealth of Virginia. And when the Virginia governor says that he needs to meet with you, that is what she's doing right now. So we'll see if we get her on. All right, so let's start with, I'm going to kick it off, Ankur, if you don't mind kicking us off with the first question. How have you seen agency security posture change in the last several years due to ransomware? Could you please speak to your experience with that?
I think the latest attack that we probably all saw was over the holidays last year when everyone was hit with malware and had to take a knee-jerk reaction to this whole log4j vulnerability that showed up. The response was pretty well coordinated, but it also kind of highlighted that there's a need to have a more of a well thought out approach to handle situations like this. And I don't know if it was specifically based on a reaction to that event or not, but in January of this year, the Office of the President issued a memorandum for moving the US government towards zero trust security that's based on 5 pillars. So obviously there's enough traction at the highest level on cybersecurity and protecting our data infrastructure and all those things. So we're going to see a lot of the agencies formulate some plans, whether it is to protect their networks or the edge or data itself, but you're going to see a lot of agencies move from status quo towards zero trust implementations over the next 2 to 3 fiscal years.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit later on in the panel discussion. Aaron, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, there's a greater increase of knowledge, I think is the most important thing, and often knowledge of how we responded in the past. You know, how successful were we? What were the challenges? What were the lessons learned? And so there's a greater understanding between the organization and IT that they need to work together on it, because there was quite a big, in many cases, bigger impact than people thought was going to happen. And if they were recovering, which the customers that we talk to, because we do the recovery from ransomware, is there was a longer time to recover than expected, because the attack didn't kind of happen. If you can plan one of these things, but you plan for as many eventualities as you can plan for, but they didn't occur as was expected, and things change. So what I'm seeing is more people prepared to do more organization, more planning, more alignment between the organization and IT, and have a better response for the next time.
Yeah. Stephen, would you say that that's reign true for the Department of Education?
So fortunately, we haven't seen a whole lot of ransomware. Lots of reasons for that we'll probably touch on as we work through it. Not for lack of trying. We certainly get our fair share. We do have some fairly robust inline defenses. However, when it comes to talking about our resilience, this discussion around making sure that we have the right backups, the right capabilities, the right distribution across geography in some cases is vitally important for us. We hold about a third of the nation's PII. We have over $1 trillion accounts receivable. And so for us, resilience is an absolute pillar of who we are as an organization. And when we think about ransomware, it's certainly a critical dimension that we're facing, but we're also looking at things like, can we handle 100 million hits all at once? And if a system goes down, can we bring it up quickly?
Thank you, Stephen. And Nick, I would love to hear from you as well.
All right, thanks, Kirsten. So what we've seen, particularly since I would say the RYUK incidents of 2017 and 18 is a significantly greater emphasis placed on obviously resiliency, but especially speed of recovery. We are in an era where backups alone are no longer sufficient. Being able to bring your critical data back in weeks to months is perilous, and particularly in the national security space and government spaces. And I'd say that the federal government has led the way in implementing continuity of operation strategies, redundancy and failover. They've led the way in cybersecurity and hardening of the exterior defenses. But the purpose of this conversation is continuity of operations and recovery. So the emphasis now we're seeing is no longer primarily on backup for the sake of regulatory compliance and data maintenance, but really on data leverage, primary, secondary, and recovery data services. So we've seen a profound shift in data architectures to include now intermediate recovery targets for bringing back, a 6-month to 1 year long period of data in minutes to hours, as opposed to extended duration recovery processes from, archival and backup holdings. And I see Aaron, Stephen, and Ankur all nodding their heads because we've been partners with federal government, state, local, and higher education customers for the past 4 years in helping them start to, implement exactly these kinds of mechanisms and strategies to facilitate getting back into business and operations quickly, and then larger scale recovery over a longer period of time in the background. So we live, unfortunately, in exciting times in the data protection and integrity space.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Nick. Go
I
ahead.
think it's fair. Sorry, I think it's fair to say that if we all want to have prevention, but what we've learned is that when someone has been attacked, and maybe it's an encryption type attack, that the impact on the data is a greater percentage than all the other kinds of failures that we used backup and recovery for in the past. It's at least 50%, sometimes as much as 90% of data has been affected in the companies and the organizations I've talked to. So as Nick says, if people start to plan for that level of scale of recovery in a performant way, then every other type of failure event that they might need to come back from a backup is already covered, because if you can recover 90% in a timely manner, you're good to go on everything else.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. Any other comments on that? All right, let's pop up poll question number 1 then. I think that segues pretty nicely. If an attack happens, what does your remediation timeline look for your most critical systems? So minutes, hours, or days? Please respond to that if you'd like to receive your CPE credits. All right, jumping back over to Encore then, how are you evaluating solutions differently as a result of ransomware and other APT factors?
So before we even get to the solution piece, right? I think what everybody was hinting at is we kind of have to not treat responding to attacks or preventing attacks at the tail end of you already have a system now, how do you prevent it? You have to build it to be secure in a manner, right? So if you spread your data across availability zones in a cloud, probably better than having all of the things in the same place. Or if you have an immutable vault somewhere, probably better than just relying on whatever comes to natively to AWS RDS automated backups. So we have to start approaching security when we plan and design these solutions so that they don't come as an aftershock, right? Because unfortunately for us, when I'm talking about me, Steve, and anybody that's involved in the federal space, we don't have the luxury of inheriting a green field where we can build a brand new solution every time, right? So we have these systems that have been designed and built over time. Some of them were formerly mainframes that somebody said, it's a great idea to convert this into an Oracle database. And all of a sudden now you have this gigantic structure that you have to manage, which on the flip side presents a huge attack surface, right? So securing those things has a very different strategy, which is more reactive, putting in firewalls, making sure you have enough backup. It's expensive, versus something that you're going to build today, because now you can containerize things, you can shard your databases, you can use multiple availability zones, you can have redundancy in terms of having read copies. So there are technical solutions available today that unfortunately were not a part of the design and thought process 15, 20 years ago, but we're still living with the systems that were built during that time. So our approach has to be sort of forked a little bit. And I want to hear from everybody else is what if their experience is the same, or how are they tackling those things?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Encore. Stephen, let's jump to you next.
So the department here, we're effectively 100% outsourced. So we're pretty much 100% in the cloud, save a few wiring closets. And what that's meant is that we've really had to evolve our thinking about contracting and agreements. And I think, most folks are very savvy about, having strong SLAs is a great part of any contract. But something that you'll see is that SLAs aren't going to save you from the 0-day. SLAs aren't going to save you from, whoops, we forgot about something. And the real challenge there is you don't find out until after the fact. It's a right of boom conversation when you find out your SLA actually failed. And in some cases, when it's a sad story, the contractor is like, you know what? I'll just eat the fine. I will eat the punishment, the monetary or whatever for the SLA, versus doing what we ought to be doing to keep services going. And that's a very unfortunate situation for all of us. So what we've seen is an evolution in thinking about, it's not just SLAs. SLAs are great targets, but then it's actually testing against the SLAs on some reoccurring basis. And that could range from tabletop to partial interruption to full interruption, to see, can my vendor and can my partner in this space actually execute when the chips are down, time is short, and we need to make sure the services are available. And that's a different relationship, especially when we're thinking about service consumption, because now it's not not just I'm going to consume all these awesome services from the cloud and my partners around. It's also they are going to be true shoulder to shoulder to partners, and they're going to practice with me. They're going to be participants when we go through and we do these tabletops, we do these interruption tests, and we're going to see, can they perform as well as the SLA states? And what about the 0 days? Well, let's tabletop for that. Things do fail, and what are we going to do in those spaces? I think that over time, we're going to see more and more of either, I want external attestation from our vendors that they can do this and it's been tested by an objective party, or I want you to play with me. I want you to come out on the field and practice with me so that when we need to actually execute, we're not picking the phone up and saying, hi, Bob, this is Steve. This is the first time we've talked, but we're going to go through a contingency together.
Right. Thank you, Stephen. Nick, I would love to hear from you next.
So this is in the warm up to this call a couple of weeks ago. Aaron and I were talking about how long Veeam and Pure Storage have been working together on ransomware remediation and mitigation. So we really kind of pioneered the first reference architecture for this in 2015, 16, because we saw it coming. It's not accidental. Aaron's been doing this for a long time, and I came out of the federal government. So what we've seen is, to Stephen's point, there are things you simply cannot prepare for. There are things we want to do as vendors to help our customers partner up to support their security, their integrity, and their resiliency. But 0-day vulnerabilities, and Log4j is probably the most spectacular one, because I don't know that people fully appreciate that Log4j is in almost literally every platform software baseline that uses Java logging. It was everywhere. We had phone calls and, from sun up to sundown and well into the middle of the night from customers who were terrified to find out that literally everything they had this vulnerability in it. It was a worldwide disaster. Ankur was right. The industry response and the government responses, the customer responses to remediation were spectacular. I've almost never seen an entire planet move that fast, or at least an entire IT planet. And Stephen's also correct. There are vendors who will sit there and go, it's just too much work. It could be, there are technical reasons why they can't respond in a timely fashion to something. I will say from, long experience, making a change at the core of a software baseline is easy. Testing it is the hard part, because you can't release something again that is broken, buggy, or itself vulnerable. We work very hard. If we can't do any of that in a timely fashion, and a customer can't accept the change as quickly as we need to, configuration control boards are a real thing, then what do? We have to protect the data itself. That's what Aaron was saying earlier. If we can ensure that the data integrity remains intact, we have some breathing room and a little bit of vulnerability mitigation against data contamination or corruption, while we can work to remediate the situation in the operational infrastructure, or I'm sitting here thinking of other things, just trying to prevent anything bad from happening to our data itself. Systems are fixable, but data once corrupted is irreparable, irretrievable. As people always ask me, why do I work for a storage company? Mostly because I love data. Data service and data itself allows us to do what we do across every field of human endeavor. So that's actually the most important thing we need to focus on. Ankur hinted at it. We're not thinking about system integrity, system protection, system resiliency anymore. We're thinking about data lifecycle and data custody. When we take legacy systems and we need to bring them into a 21st century data management and data custodianship, data stewardship type of operating model, that's hard. But if we're thinking about the systems that enable us to do that and the full end-to-end stream to support that data lifecycle, then it makes changes in technology platforms easier to manage and sustain. And we always, we always have to think about, what are we going to do with this data? Where's it going to go? Where's it going to live? Who leverages it? How do I make that available in a new architectural environment? And these are all the things that I really enjoy engaging with customers about to help them figure it out. The federal government's an unusual beast in that it's been doing digital data since the 1940s. Very few entities in the world have over 100 years worth of data, and even fewer entities in the world have customers who are over 100 years old, which is why we keep data for 100 years. There are people still drawing benefits or filing taxes who are over, they're over the usual life cycle of data custody. But that's the reality of governments, and that's why helping address these situations, and particularly making robust and resilient data environments, is incredibly important. And I'd say more, but I've gone long already. So
well said.
Thanks.
Aaron, any comments from you on that?
Yeah, so how things have changed. Well, there's a number of things. One of the things that we've been talking about for a few years now is that people need to build in testing into their planning, so that, as Nick was talking about earlier, it's one thing to make sure you've got it protected and policy enforced and monitored, and you've got good copies, but are you really prepared for that recovery? And we don't, it's not like the traditional stuff in the past where you did it once a year, twice a year, maybe 4 times a year if you were like the highest achievers on recovery testing. This is building recovery testing capability into your systems continuously, and things that are reflective of a real world scenario. And it could be for many reasons. If failures crept in as you've patched the system, of failures crept in as other changes have happened, as the data grown, but there's lots of benefits. There's lots of benefits to doing it, and because innovation happens. What I found interviewing customers who have managed to recover without is that there was innovations that happened while people were under pressure. Well, if you start to test things, you start to plan it into your normal business's normal operations, then the innovation happens before you need it, and that's a great benefit. And if you take, like as Nick and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, you take the modular solutions that we have for the fastest recovery, and then the nearly as fast recovery, and then you can plan for each requirement of each tier of application, and you can plan for each scenario. Is it this copy of data that got lost? Is it this copy? And know exactly how fast it's going to be, and at least you can predict to your organization what's going to happen because you've done it so many times before.
Thank you. Any other comments here before I call for the next poll? All right, poll number 2, please. Let's get that up on the screen. Have you changed the way that you secure primary and backup storage to avoid threat actors deleting primary or backup data? Please respond, and then we will post those results on the screen momentarily. All right, next question. Let's start with Stephen this time. Stephen, if an attack does happen, what does your remediation plan look like? Do you have an incident response plan in place?
Yeah, so all departments and agencies are required to have a plan in place for, frankly, any type of disruption, including cybersecurity. Our plan follows a lot of what you would see in the NIST guidance and the CISA guidance around first understanding what the situation is, getting operational and tactical visibility into what's happening. 2, trying to contain and make sure that if damage is spreading or if actions are occurring across the enterprise, that we have a way to limit the amount of influence or impact that it has. Once we've contained, we typically move into understanding what makes this thing tick, or what is the root cause, more of analysis. And then frankly, we get into recovery and restoration. Making sure that whatever impact was incurred, hopefully we can recover from it. Hopefully it's information that we do have stored somewhere else if there's an integrity or availability concern. And then meanwhile, in parallel, oftentimes we'll have an investigation underway, especially if we suspect there's a criminal element to this. And I think that in those 2 areas, particularly the recovery of system and data, and then the investigation investigation, there are two very important elements about data integrity that happen, very separate, but both very important. The first one along system restoration, making sure that as we're coming back up, we're bringing back information, and most importantly, we understand what we didn't get back. Are there gaps in the data? Are there things where, you know what, we do have a paper record of XYZ, we may have to pull it out somewhere and get that data back in. So understanding the verification of the data with what was before and what after, a very important point. The other pieces on the Inspector General side and the investigation side is, as we're collecting the what happened and the root cause and what we're seeing, we have to be storing all of that. And I loved the fact that immutable storage was one of the questions, or one of the answers to the question, because that's what we have to do for the investigative side of the track, to give our law enforcement partners the evidence they need. And oftentimes that's making a forensically sound copy from what we have, sometimes the actual data if it's implicated, and making sure we can tuck that away so that our investigators can use it as evidence down the line.
Thank you, Stephen. And Ankur, same question over to you.
Yeah, I think so. Just like Stephen, our entire infrastructure is also in AWS. So most of the strategies remain pretty much the same. It's the same cycle of recognizing you've been attacked, isolating or insulating the impact, doing your analysis of what's going wrong, and then recovering based on whatever your options are. Fortunately for us, we haven't really had a instance where we've had to activate that plan, and hopefully it stays the same. But the basic elements remain the same. So I think Steve covered it really well.
Great. And would our industry subject matter experts like to weigh in?
Yes. So Ankur raised a really good point. I want to give a hat tip to Veeam for coming up with the concept of the 3-2-1 based backup and recovery architecture paradigm. So you may have 3 copies of your data in 2 different locations, one of them in the cloud. DOT's done a step even further, where their entire architecture lives in the cloud. But as Ankur said, the principles of data management and data stewardship apply just as reliably and soundly in somebody else's architecture as they do it on premises. You have to have a tremendously resilient, and I don't want to say distributed or diffused, but you've got to have an attack surface. It's hard to take out everything all at once. There is probably the best way to say it. So it's got to be resilient, and it's got to be, it's easy. It's harder to hit multiple targets for a bad guy, I guess is the way I want to say it. The other thing is the fundamental layer of data management and data service platforms. You know, we used to call them storage, but it's so much more than that. Has really changed. We used to be, the way metadata gets managed these days, particularly in modernized data environments like AWS, like Azure, like modern memory-based storage arrays, and the software that connects all of them together, makes moving this data, makes making forensic analysis of that data tremendously more efficient from a time consumption perspective than it was in the past. It also makes, it's really the key behind this immutable snapshot capability that enables incredibly rapid iteration of the data, being able to create copies of the data, because you don't have to do full byte for byte, block for block copies of data anymore. The metadata snapshot architectures that modern arrays, and particularly Pure Storage employs, and Veeam leverages, make this kind of data replication and the provision of that data to investigators tremendously faster than it has been in the past. What I wanted to say earlier at the beginning of this, the poll question, that's really the previous poll question, what's your recovery window look like? Is it minutes? Is it hours? Is it days? It was only 6 or 7 years ago that answer was going to be in my dreams. Could I ever recover my environment in minutes to hours? And now it's a reality. It's actually so reliable. It's an operational planning figure for what happens if, you know, as Mike Tyson once said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? Now we have the opportunity to walk our way through what happens after first contact, what happens after the event. if we can understand what may happen at the right of the bang, to quote Steve Hernandez, we can start taking effective measures to the left of the bang to know what are we going to do when something goes bump in the night, and know reliably that the actions we're going to take are effective. Because the other thing is you can rehearse these things effectively now. Aaron had talked about it before. You might do a backup and recovery drill, or at least a recovery drill quarterly, which caused me to raise an eyebrow and smile. But you can actually do this as a recurrent plan, as an operational exercise, without disrupting your current operations. That's kind of important. Without sucking up all of your staff's time for the next 3 weeks, trying to validate whether or not the recovery process worked. You can actually execute this in minutes to hours. You can do it in a working day. Drills that are practiced are effectively executed when it counts. And that, I think, is a tremendous occurrence that very few people are paying an awful lot of attention to. We can practice our recovery drills and our continuity of operations plans in the normal working day without taking down the enterprise, which is kind of important for people who are working outside, working off the systems we maintain and sustain. So these are, we live in really great times from the data stewardship, data continuity, and data management aspect. It's scary, but because the threat vectors are myriad, and the number of attacks we're sustaining on a daily basis is enormous. I don't even want to know what all of our various external defense mechanisms are intercepting that we never see. That's, but we know that government is a high value target, healthcare is a high value target, universities are high value targets, and they are under siege. But we're developing mechanisms that allow us to absorb those hits and respond to them and recover from them in ways that were unimaginable even 5 short years ago.
Thank you, Nick. Aaron, any additional thoughts?
Sure. I think it was Stephen that mentioned the NIST guidance, and I take that diagram. If people haven't seen it, it's kind of circular, and it implies, or more than implies, it kind of states continuous improvement is something we should be driving for. So I think we've had a lot of good education out there over the last 3 years. Customers have adopted making data, secure and offline from attack. The principle really is, if I can make it protected from a trusted admin with the right privileges, because it's immutable, then I've kind of protected myself from an attacker. But now we're looking at kind of improving on that and looking at all aspects of, say, the MITRE ATT&CK framework for mitigation techniques, and saying that every part of infrastructure or account logins or anything that's goes around our backup and restore organizational piece, make sure that we're not contributing to any ability to discover things from an attacker, have got privileges if I've managed to get something, and make sure I can't do any lateral movement and get somewhere else where I shouldn't be. It's kind of, people are iterating on it and containerizing the threat. So at least instead of what I talked earlier about, some attacks used to be as much as 90%. Now, even if there is still some success, it's limited as much as possible, because the account that I managed to get into, it kept me in a very small location, and I wasn't able to expand out of there. And I see a lot more people wanting to get into that, and and there's no longer this, well, I shouldn't do it because it makes my life more difficult. It makes admin. Everybody accepts that these things are just important and we should do it. And certainly you should push back if anybody does resist against, segmenting and controlling the attack.
Thank you, Aaron. Any additional comments or insights before we move on?
No, one thing I want to mention is, this also highlights the importance of truly understanding the data your organization collects and the importance or impact of that data collection and data processing on your ability to carry out your mission. Very often we see these, response strategies or cybersecurity policies that are like painted with a broad brush and say everything should be protected the same way, or everything should be done one way, irrespective of how important data may or may not be. And at the end of the day, these things become super expensive if you just try to do one thing for everything. So it's important that we layer our security to say, okay, this data is super important to us, so we'll do the 3-2-1 for this one. But on the other side, yeah, I see why we collect this data, but if this goes down for a week, we won't perish as an organization, right? So we can take some chance on it. The last thing you ever want to do is be in like an alarmist that says this once in a lifetime event may happen next week to us, and so let's spend $1 million a week protecting that. Then that's not a good strategy either, because at the end of the day, at least from where I'm sitting and where Steve is, we are funding everything through taxpayer dollars, and we want to make sure that we are being very responsible when it comes to spending that money. So that balance of, yes, we have to protect, and how much should be very well thought out.
Thank you, Ankur. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd like to talk on that one. I think that's personally it's something I talk about a lot, because you see a lot of sometimes this instinct to design for like the perfect scenario and build the most highest available system. And that's great. That might be, like you said, like Ankur says, for your tier 1 systems, but it's so unaffordable, you can't actually do it at scale. And so if you're going to then have to do it differently for each kind of tier of system, then you could introduce complexity. So one of the great ways of achieving doing it at scale is trying to remove differences and have more consistency. And at Veeam, we look to try and deliver solutions that can work with partners like Pure, that you've got something modular. It looks the same, it integrates, you do it this way, and you can do it the same way, but at a different price point, a different performance point, and you've got a whole range of solutions right through to taking a copy into the cloud and maybe using that as your last point of safety. But even then, you know, that there are ways that you can do something across clouds, but that consistency is the important thing, and having the right price point across the entire range of recovery that you need. You certainly shouldn't ever go for like one size fits all.
Excellent. Nick shared a meme in the chat. All right. Well, let's pop up poll question number 3, please. How often do you test your cyber incident response plan? Please respond to that. Okay, and we've got a little bit of time to talk about this here too. Stephen, maybe you can kick us off here. What specific things are you looking for now in infrastructure, backup and storage, RFPs?
Yeah, so I touched on this a little bit, so I'll touch on it again, but then get into some more specifics. This idea of really partnering with providers that understand the necessity for our recovery time objectives, our interruption objectives, and they speak that language. When I'm talking about the continuity of operations plan and how that ferrets into everything else in my organization in terms of IT continuity, those are the folks that we're looking to work with. And the way that pans out for us is a lot of it, you know, first, since we're largely cloud, we look for things like, well, do you at least pass FedRAMP? 1, because OMB says you have to, but 2, there's a whole bunch of controls in there around availability and resilience, and we'd like to see how well a provider is actually meeting that. But even when we look on-prem in our facilities and what's happening there, supply chain is a huge concern right now. Are we working with vendors and providers that, one, can not only meet our requirements from a manufacturing and foreign influence perspective, but also can they just get us parts and pieces when we need them? Can they get us the actual hardware when we need it, versus saying, throw up the hand, supply chain, and maybe 6 to 9 months, we'll get it there. And here again, this is more than just what are folks committing to in the contract on paper. It's what are they actually able to deliver? You know, if I happen to stroll into one of our closets, one of our data centers, pull a drive, slam it on the floor, whoops, bad me, how quick do I get that replacement drive from my vendor back in the slot? Those are some very real concerns that, frankly, before COVID and even just due to the evolution of technology 5 years ago, we weren't having those same conversations at that time. So I think that this idea of a deep understanding of both the partner that we're working with and their understanding of us and what we require, that's getting more ferreted out in the RFPs that we're putting on the streets today.
Thank you, Stephen. Would any of our other panelists like to respond to that question as well? Aaron, go ahead.
Well, certainly we've seen the RFPs requesting information about us as an organization, that we have our own ISO certification, that we understand security, that we run ourselves in the secure and organized way, that our software has a secure supply chain. So that these have become more important. They didn't used to be in RFPs, but in the last 2 or 3 years, absolutely for sure. And we've had to respond to that.
Yeah. All right.
Look,
Go ahead. Sorry.
I am seeing at the macro level, at the department level, mandates and standards being developed to ensure that supply chain is evaluated in addition just to system security. And when I'm thinking particularly of CMMC 1.0 and CMMC 2.0 out of the Department of Defense, and of course then there's NIST 800-53, there's NIAP Common Criteria Validation, there's ISO 27001, ISO 9001, and we are, I can speak from our experience, we are, working diligently to ensure that we're ticking all the boxes. I am appreciative of FedRAMP and the adoption of FedRAMP by the US government for providing industry with a single security validation, certification, and accreditation for as-a-service platform adoption. I don't know that we can adequately communicate how much time and money goes into obtaining these international and national standards accreditations. We recognize the necessity of them, and we recognize the validity of them. But man, it would be great if we had just one.
Mhm.
I'll put that right next to the unicorn, my friend.
I know, right?
But it is the goal. It is the goal.
Yeah. To that end, we recognize also that various departments have particular needs. When you take a look at organizations that operate in the national security system space, that's actually outside scope of FISMA altogether. Under the law, the intelligence community, the national security community operate an even more stringent set of standards. And those have to, those all have to be taken into account. So we, wherever the data is, we make systems to support data leverage in those environments. So we're continually scanning RFPs and proposals and engagements with customers on what standard do you want to implement. So we're always grateful when our customers know what they want to point us to validate that we have accomplished exactly what Stephen said. Did we meet the defined and identified security metrics or the subset of controls that are particularly relevant to a given deployment? So I want to thank the government for knowing that, for getting that in the contracting solicitations and the request for proposal up front, so that we know what we need to say to them and what we need to show them in order to validate with a simple yes answer on the RFP what we're complying with or what we're asserting we're going to comply with. I spent years in government and I loathed getting volumes 1 and volumes 2 of an RFP response. I liked the guys who put a matrix up front with all of my requirements and said yes, 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 yes. And that makes it a lot easier for us. If we know what you need us to say or what you need us to do, the response can be very, very brief. If we got to go fishing, oh, it's agonizing.
Any other comments from the panelists on that? All right. Well, we read a lot about zero trust initiatives in federal IT these days. So, Encore, maybe I can start with you on this one. How are you seeing that play out at your own agency? You're muted.
Oh, you're muted,
Yeah,
Ankur.
sorry. I'm saying number one thing that's going to happen is somebody way above my pay grade is going to come down and say, thou shalt do this in the next 12 months, right? So, and that's usually how every great project in the government starts. And we are seeing some of that starting to play out after that memorandum was issued last year. I believe there's a department-wide mandate that every single application needs to be multi-factor authentication enabled by the end of next calendar year. And I'm sure that's step one of many. Next is going to be all data at rest and in transit going to be encrypted, and then we'll move to what those data structures look like and whatnot. So the wheels are in motion. Some of them are needed. And while I say it in jest, but some of the policies and procedures do need strong championship and very strong encouragement from high up, because folks love status quo. Like, it's working, it hasn't gone down in the last 5 years, but they don't understand that, especially in security, past performance is not an indicator of future performance, right? So unless somebody comes with the sense of urgency, which is, again, even in change management, that's step one, create urgency. So that push is needed for us to change. Having an executive order, an OMB memo, the department CIO laying down some mandates to build out some sort of a roadmap that addresses CIS's 5 pillars is really helpful. And I think while we're just starting with encryption and multi-factor authentication, I'm pretty sure we're going to move on to standardization of network equipment, some sort of a standard on applications and how workloads look like in the cloud. And while we are taking advantage of some cloud security services to monitor access and whatnot, it's still very fragmented and dependent on who shows up to work and how good of a job they do. I think as we see things progress, we'll see more enterprise-wide policies, standardization, and some sort of SLAs and SOPs put into place. So that's how I see us playing for the next 2 to 3 years, I think.
Thank you. Stephen, would you like to respond as well?
Yeah, no, I think Anchor hit a lot of areas. The pieces that I'll say is when we look at the executive order, there's this discussion around big, bold changes, not just iterative kind of Kaizen improvement over time, but frankly, just transformative shifts. And one of the ways we've seen that is through the Technology Modernization Fund. And we've seen security projects get through there now that frankly in the past, I don't know if they would have made it. But now that the executive order is out, we have that strong tie-in. And it's fascinating to think about that conversation, because cybersecurity for at least as long as I can remember it, it's largely been about, tools and technologies and capabilities and people, having the right people there to do that job. But often absent in that conversation was this idea of user experience and also modernization. And I think that those are two big areas that are being pushed now that frankly, it probably wasn't the right time in the past to really bring them forward, but now it is. When security can become the default choice, the easy choice, the best choice, the user will make that decision correctly every single time. And we have the technology and the capability now to do that. We can make many of the security decisions for the user, or at least give the user the option that the default choice, the easiest choice, is also the secure choice. And we see that in a lot of different ways. For example, when very simple thing, mapping a user's documents directory to their then on-prem and or cloud linked storage for auto replication. and maybe one of those copies is immutable depending on what your department and agency is doing. Very simple configuration and engineering step, transparent to the user, but by golly, when the chips are down and the user needs the action and the user needs the recovery, or we've got an e-discovery or a FOIA and that user's now gone and that particular device has been handed off and wiped to someone else, wow, all of a sudden everything we needed is still there. And so I think that is what we've been called to do, and really look at the future in terms of how can we deliver not only security, but do it in such a way where we enhance and promote that user experience at the same time.
Thank you, Stephen. Nick or Aaron, would you like to comment next?
Aaron,
Sure,
go ahead.
I'll go. Yeah, I mean, zero trust, for me, it just comes naturally. I think the guy who invented Murphy's Law was an American engineer who believed if anything can go wrong, it will. And I kind of always felt the same way about everything. So, you know, if I ever did anything to destroy data, I'd always make sure I had 3 copies of it, and I already tested every store so that I knew it was working before I would destroy anything. So completely agree with it. Now, it's great, I think, for the federal organizations that they've got this mandate, because outside in other parts of industry, one of the problems that I talk a lot to CIOs about is if they're not aligned in the business, if they're not part of the board, that they struggle with the mandate to get people on board with zero trust and making these changes. So I think it's fabulous, and I think people should be using that mandate to enact the change and really take a, if it can go wrong, it will attitude to these things.
Nick, did you want to go next?
Yeah, honestly, I applaud several of OMB's most recent directives. The requirement to move to IPv6 is a great example. We spent a couple of decades now, well, at least a decade now, procuring the infrastructure necessary to do it. The zero trust mandate really is a continuation in my assessment of the HSPD 12 directive to implement CAC-PIV. Another thing that's really significantly assisted that is the advent of, you know, widely distributed security frameworks like OAuth, OIDC, and SAML 2.0. All of these things start to make that kind of granular security and control significantly easier. To Stephen's point, it has become tremendously easier, both as an administrator, as a vendor, as a solution provider, to deliver a solution to a customer that enables them to conveniently implement security that is convenient for users to leverage. And the dynamic tension has always been, you know, up here in this part of the diagram, you've got security. And then down here in this part of the diagram, you've got convenience. And they are diametrically opposed forces most of the time. But when systems can be engineered to provide security as a fundamental mechanism, they're just built that way, then implementing them is tremendously easier. Then you don't even have to know that you're taking advantage of it. In the modern day, for example, in data service platforms, encryption at rest is automatic. The modules, the cryptographic modules for doing AES 256 are built into the platforms. Speaking for mine, and I can point out several others, there is no data that's stored in a pure storage array that is unencrypted, period. It's all encrypted. The funny part is when we, you know, customers ask us if we can show that in an audit, we're like, well, then we had to go build things that enable us to show, yes, all of your data is encrypted. But for access controls, you know, you're watching manufacturers now get rid of engineering accounts, static root passwords, and everything, and only permitting, you know, one-time password authorizations or validated accounts that the customer sets up to enable access to those systems. I think it is a very good thing, but I also am grateful that the technology has evolved really in the last, since the advent of cloud, mobile applications and things of that nature, to facilitate implementing those so that they are not speed bumps for user adoption or use of systems, or for infrastructure managers for management of those systems. So we're kind of living in good security times. You know, a lot of these things have been a response to very bad things that have happened, but it makes it predictable for everybody when we understand what the security framework is and what the mechanisms that are inherent in our software and our hardware that permit implementation within that security framework.
Yeah, one thing I also want to add is, I think everybody alluded to that. Having these mandates and memorandums and executive orders, what this has allowed us to do is have security lead the architectural decisions versus being an afterthought, right? Some of the security problems are already figured out in terms of what the solution could be, versus saying, hey, you have to go be MFA compliant, and you leave it for the agency to wonder, okay, I don't have a solution right now, what do I do, right? We live in a time when there's login.gov or Okta or two other things that you already may be using. So that takes away that mental burden you would have about figuring that out, because it's already been figured out. There's a CDM program that helps you monitor stuff. There's login.gov that has that MFA figured out for you, or you can say use RDS for your data needs and enable blah 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 options, and you'll be compliant with what we need you to do. Again, another thing that's figured out for you. So in some ways mandates are bad, but in this way at least, it's allowing security to be at the forefront of your application design, of your data management initiatives, so that you don't have to figure it out later. So I think that's where the positive spin on this thing is.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, we are just about out of time. I want to give you all a minute or two to share with our audience your final thoughts or key takeaway from this discussion that you think is the most important for our audience to leave with. So, Stephen, can I call on you to begin our wrap up of the discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Nick called out just a wonderful takeaway that I'd like to springboard off of, and that's that a lot of folks ask, zero trust, why now? This is a concept that's been around for at least a decade, more like two. And if you think about least privilege, well, ever since cave people were figuring out how to keep people in and bears out of the caves, it's really a matter of the technology, and the technology has gotten us here. And whether you're in the national security space, the cloud space, the federal space like us, it's the willingness to lean forward and embrace those new technologies that frankly is going to get us to the place where security is the enabler. I saw a cartoon the other day, and I thought it was very on point. It said, CIOs, what is your modernization strategy for the next 10 years? And there was, I read Gartner, I do this, I do that. Then the choice D was COVID. And of course, it was rapidly circled, right? And I hope that it doesn't take another nationwide pandemic or catastrophe for us to really rethink how we're leveraging technology. Hopefully that is now just part of the fabric and who we are, and we can continue to move at this pace. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, let's jump over to Aaron next.
Yeah, key takeaways. I think we all. I've moved into a more positive mode in my head around things like ransomware and recovery. I think for a few years it was all doom and gloom. It's all terrible, and because I see so much success now with people being able to respond and come back from that. And I agree there with Ankur and Stephen and Nick that security is kind of that great facilitator of understanding the threat, and that I've been working it for years, and I've been using one-time passwords for over 20 years, and now I find it's amazing it was ever even a discussion point, right? So I think it's really good that we are at that point and we're moving into that. Having said that, one of the things we said in this agenda is about doing things at scale, and I think the one thing I'd like to say is that it's not the one size fits all, as Ankur mentioned, and it's to reiterate that if you remove as many moving parts or as many choices as possible, and say partner with someone like Veeam and Pure Storage who've worked together to give you a range of solutions, then you can achieve it with much less complexity, and it's much more and have more of a guaranteed outcome.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's move over to Ankur next.
The one thing I would just like to mention is, just like architecture or design, even with security, lead with your data. Understand your data, understand how critical it is. Can you afford to lose it? If not, you should do anything and everything to protect it. If you can, don't spend that much money. Right? So it's important to have an understanding of what your enterprise does, what that data means for your mission, and what are the impacts, but if it gets compromised with ransomware or other attacks. So having that understanding would give you the less complex solution that Aaron's talking about, where you're not using the same broad brush to paint everything the same color. That would be my one takeaway if I have to think about it.
Thank you. And Nick, we'll end it with you.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists for their insights, their observations, and expressing their enthusiasm and honestly very little frustration. I think that means that we are, as a professional community, we understand the challenges, we understand the threats, but we also understand the tools and technology available to us to build a resilient, hardened enterprise to conduct our operations, and that there is a tremendous partnership between industry and between government to help facilitate better, more secure, more convenient solutions. As a vendor, the government, the federal government in particular, is the hardest space in which to operate. The good news is that if you can succeed there, meet the standards there, you can literally meet them anywhere. So that I want to continue working with government and with our partners to develop effective, efficient, affordable, and secure solutions that enable us to continue to move forward. So again, Ankur and Stephen, thank you very much. Aaron, always fun to partner with you, and to our audience, thank you very much for the great question and for your time.
Yep, thank you. Well said, everyone. And if you liked this content, you'll probably like our next webinar. It'll be up on the screen here momentarily. Oh, not a webinar, actually. It is our Federal Cloud and Infrastructure Summit hosted at the Marriott Metro Center in Washington, D.C. That'll be a fun time. So go register for that, and also respond to the last poll if you would like to receive your CPE credit for the event. All right. Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure as always. See you at the next one.
Thank you. Appreciate the conversation.
Bye.